Hello, welcome to Galactic Initiative. I'm your host, Jeff. Sean is with me. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, my friend.
For the show about George Lucas, a special guest joins Galactic Initiative, a friend whose appearance was long overdue. His name is Robert. He's been a Star Wars fan and content creator for many, many years. His YouTube channel, Talking Bird Podcast, is known for its Two Dudes Talk About series. Spoiler, Sean's the other dude. These guys have episodes about Danzig, Blade Runner, old school video games, the movies of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Great topics, deep analysis. I encourage you to visit Talking Bird Podcast. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's begin. Star Wars is a reflection of George Lucas's early life and beliefs about mythology and storytelling. It is also a contemplation of history and political science, including the United States during the mid to late 20th century. Lucas has explained the origins in countless interviews, and we'll probably cover them in this discussion, but on a personal level, Star Wars was a defining feature of our childhoods, and as adults, we still care deeply about it. We continue to watch, collect, debate, disseminate. What sets Lucas apart from other filmmakers?
In my opinion, what initially sets him apart or makes him unique as a filmmaker is what he did with the first Star Wars film. Was he on the coattails of Kubrick kind of rescued the genre of science fiction and took it from something that was filler content that you would watch before you saw a movie in the movie theater in the 30s and 40s in the form of a serial, or something that was relegated to Sunday comics or comic books, kind of a punchline, sort of a joke. We're sci-fi fans. It was an outsider genre to that point. Pulp magazines, pulp novels, short serials, black and white, either on, as appearing before movies on Saturday matinees, or later on, as George Lucas talked about growing up, that was his version of Saturday morning cartoons, in the late 50s and early 60s. But taking that and rescuing it, but doing it in a way that is timeless. I think part of the problem with science fiction up to the point of George Lucas and Star Wars was science fiction had a very it had a sort of a shelf life of not very long, and part of it is that there was a lot of focus on the science in the science fiction. And when you see things like the silent film about the journey to the moon, where they shoot a cannon and a big bullet lands in the eye of the man on the moon and everybody gets out and nobody's wearing spacesuits and all this stuff, right? The science can be very dated based on the science of the day. And George really focused on the fiction of science fiction. And yes, there's this distinction that his is not really hard science fiction, it's more space fantasy and whatnot. But up to that point, we really didn't have a robust language to talk about science fiction film. So he taking universal themes and good storytelling and core elements of, the heroism and friendship and family and conflict and good versus evil and empires and oppression versus the downtrodden and freedom, but wrapping it up in these sort of whiz-bang sci-fi concepts of spaceships and fantastic laser battles and all these things. He really kind of elevated it up from being something silly or meant for children and brought it into a broader audience and made it something worthy of discussion. And by creating this phenomenon, everybody saw Star Wars, everybody, and it was a thing, and they talked about it on the news. And the next thing you know, we're having PBS specials about the power of myth, and George Lucas is being interviewed, and suddenly science fiction became more of an intellectual pursuit in a way, and it became more acceptable in society in the public square. That was the unique contribution of Lucas and Star Wars in the broader cultural sense, but also Lucas was a pioneer in filmmaking in the sense of revolutionizing special effects and the use of computers in filmmaking, grasping burgeoning technologies and repurposing them and using them in the filmmaking process in such a way that it presented visual imagery to us that we had not seen before. On a couple of different levels, he impacted not just one time, but many times. It became sort of a hallmark of his filmmaking. It was continuously pushing the edge of special effects and pushing the boundaries of that technology that was available at the time, and then ultimately coming back with his prequels and giving us digital cinema. I mean, he basically invented digital cinema. And this two-pronged thing, he gave science fiction legitimacy, and he pushed the technology of filmmaking way beyond the limits that were available in 1977.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, I would say that, to use this word too early in the show, synergy of like what Sean says about technology and pushing forward. It's the confidence that he saw that something didn't exist, and then he set about like, well, why can't we make that? Why I don't want to just make a film and then put it out and then have everybody review it and then just make another film. He wanted, even if wasn't interested in doing a sequel in something like his earlier works, he wanted to fold back the things that he learned making that film into the experience of making the next film. And even, as a businessman, you can't underestimate his business acumen about how he would always think about, well, this film is going to finance my next film, and what lessons am I going to take away from what I've learned here to make better? And it always felt like he's thinking about 3 steps ahead every time he's doing things. And then he also had, with Star Wars, the beginnings of ILM. So it's a lot of that singular vision. I think a lot of Lucas's public persona is this kind of humble guy who's just like kind of ambling through and very quiet, but it's like you cannot build on these. You just can't make a movie the scope of the Star Wars with, like, you didn't have a vision to move forward and say, like, well, how am I going to complete this huge task with this, initially with the first Star Wars, like this limited amount of money, and then am I going to just eat through all my inspiration and all this stuff? It's just, you can kind of see that he already had a plan from the get-go. It was like a lot of talk, like immediately when Star Wars became a hit, he just pivoted to like, well, okay, now I can do the next one. And it's kind of an interesting vision of, rather than like, oh, well, how can I just make more of what I just made? It's like, no, he wanted to expand the technology. He wanted to make it better. It's like he was already tweaking the first movie before the second one. It's like, okay, well, now I'm going to change now it has a number ahead of it. Now it has a title below Star Wars. Now it's A New Hope. It's like, he's always forward thinking about how to refine and, lack of a better term, perfect what he was working with and try to make it closer to what he's doing. And yeah, he's taking very simple concepts, but sometimes it's the most simple concepts that ring most true. And I feel like that is a man of that generation, like with the science fiction serials and comic books and cheap paperbacks and the kind of stuff that even when it was initially produced in the 20s and 30s, your Robert E. Howards and stuff, a lot of that stuff, the pulps or whatever, literally implied in the name, they were trash. It was a thing to be consumed and to be thrown in the dustbin. And he literally took these things that made such a great impression on him and created a whole new language of movie making with it. So it's almost like trash to treasure in some regards. It's like, without a George Lucas, a lot of that stuff I think would have just fallen by the cultural wayside, and people would have just kind of said, oh yeah. When I was a kid, I used to read about John Carter. I used to read about Buck Rogers, and that was my childhood, and who cares? But now he kind of elevated something that was considered a base art form. And I don't know if that was his intent, but it definitely was a depiction of something of, he did have a true love of that kind of thing, and it's very evident.
Yeah, Star Wars is more than spaceships, and his technological advances were necessary to tell stories, to complete his visions, not devices to build stories around. And he considers himself a storyteller, and in interviews, that's where his focus is. So How do you rate him as a storyteller?
I mean, as far as film goes, probably among the best. You could disparage his dialogue. You could make comments about like, well, some of his stories, if he's so trying to elevate it, why are these weird inconsistencies in, say, the original trilogy, with the aspect of the relationship between Luke and Leia? Because, he likes to say, oh, I developed this all in my head in one big thing, and then I just had to chip off what I could afford to make at the time. And again, I don't necessarily, I believe the main thrust of his story was like that, but the finer details, I think that's the real storytelling. It's like, how do you, whatever you can criticize, you can't criticize it that these are just, they're classic stories. They made sense to people in this late 70s. They made sense to people when they re-released them in the late 90s. And still, when you get a young child and you kind of just plop them in front of the TV and say, oh, let's put this on and see what happens, the universality of the themes of Star Wars, they still connect. I think it's a thing where it's like, I don't think it matters if you are an American or wherever you live. I think there's something about it. It's like, George had basically, I think, had kind of said that his movies are really visual more so. His storytelling is more of a visual thing because, again, so you can have clunky dialogue or archaic dialogue or whatever. But he said, you can watch my movies with the sound off. And I've done that. And it's the stories are, even though I'm already aware of what the story is, but it's like you're still like, I was watching The Phantom Menace, the scene where after the pod race and Qui-Gon is going to be taking Anakin away from Shmi and they're going to go on the ship. And I just had the sound off for some reason. And it's just the way that he cut the image of him Anakin leaving, and then all of a sudden stopping and then going back. And it's like, if you listen to it with the audio on, okay, you get this kind of archaic dialogue, but as a visual, it's just the way he's communicating this thing of like, they've built up to the point about how much this woman loved her child, and then all of a sudden she wanted everything for him and he was a slave, and then he's going away. It's like there's all this emotion, and a lot of it's the acting. And I think it's like, because sometimes George gets some stick for like, oh, you don't know how to direct people. But he definitely does. Maybe he doesn't know how to direct people, but he definitely knows how to pick actors. And he picked people that can kind of bring his vision to life. And it's like, it's all there. It's kind of like you really can watch a Star Wars movie with maybe just the score, or even with nothing at all. And he's telling these universal stories of heroism and loss and pain and people being afraid and people and getting over their fear, or the longing of a Luke Skywalker who wants more out of life than working on a farm, and the looking over that vista of the two suns setting. And it's just, there's so much embedded in the information embedded in this imagery that it's at a certain point you have to realize that his storytelling is not just his dialogue. It's the choices he makes. It's the emphasis. It's who he picks, how they look, and how he wants to portray them. And as I go on, it's like it becomes very apparent that his storytelling is impeccable. It's like, it literally, you could just release these things that almost as a series of paintings, or series of photographs, and it would still be able to tell that same story in a satisfactory way.
I would totally agree with that. His storytelling, I mean, the core themes of the stories that he is telling are, of course, eternal themes, right? Any struggle that humankind has faced is encapsulated at some point in the saga of films that he's created. Loss, love, war, friendship, the meaning of life, like all these things that humanity has wrestled with for millennia, the core elements of what's going on with these characters. Yeah, they might wear funny outfits and they might have robot counterparts and they fly around on spaceships, but good, and there is evil, and there is right and wrong, and there's doing the right thing, and there's having honor and integrity, and all these things, and the importance of friendship and family, and for lack of a better word, and not to sound weird, but faith, whatever that faith may be in, the power of hope and Campbell and the hero of a thousand faces and the monomyth and the Jungian philosophy behind all of that. But George did go to school initially for anthropology and psychology. But the problem that we see, and one of the things that Robert had mentioned about directors, it's like, I just want to get my movie made and then I can go on and make another movie and I can have this career in Hollywood and hopefully I'll stay relevant and people will know my name and I can do interviews and I can be on 60 Minutes or whatever. George wasn't really worried about that in the sense of, having this disposable Hollywood career. You see directors, they move from project to project. They don't really have any interest or passion in what they're doing. It was a really great opportunity. You hear that a lot in Hollywood when people get interviewed. They go on these, press junkets. It's like, oh, it's such a great opportunity to be involved in this. But this was a passion project. This was something that he created completely. Most Hollywood productions are a confluence of creative forces. It might be a novel that was discovered that has a great story or great characters in it. And so there was a writer there who was a creative who had a vision. And then there is a production department and an art department that takes those descriptions out of that novel and creates art. And then there's a director who gets handed all this stuff. There might be another couple, 3 writers that took the book and adapted it to a screenplay. And then the director gets all these pieces and then visually does something with it. Then you have the actors, of course, that contribute. But George took most of that stuff and did it himself before he even started. He had brought people in to work with, and he'd have these visioning sessions with them, talking about what the characters would look like even before the script was finished. He would talk to them about, I want them to kind of look like this, and then I have this idea in my head, and it has to be this way. And then people would bring him things, and he would say, that's the one that was in my brain, right? Like, or take this piece here and that piece here and put it together. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Nothing was forced upon George in the creation of this story by a production company or by the studio or anyone. It was 100% his decision-making process. And this is something that ultimately wound up maybe hurting him a little bit in the prequels, but it really helped him establish this whole thing, with the first Star Wars film. And to Robert's point, all that stuff came together where visually you don't have to have the sound on to understand what is being communicated to you. I mean, George wrote his plot and his dialogue, but he also laid it out visually in the presentation of the film, where you didn't necessarily need the plot or the dialogue. When Darth Vader comes through that door, even with the sound off and no music and the miraculous score of John Williams, like, you don't need that. When that guy walks through the door, he's the bad guy. He is visually telling you by the costume that character has, the way he carries himself, and what he's involved in. He's the bad guy. It's very simple in one way, the way that these things are communicated visually to us, and then the way that the story is told. It's very simple in one way, but it's very profound and deep in another way. That we use these simple visual cues of color and set design and action and all these things to communicate these larger consequential things. And the example that Robert used about Anakin leaving home is one of them. I mean, you were talking about so many emotions in this moment, and the fact that you can see that without having to hear it or listen to it or have the characters tell you what's going on. I mean, it just speaks to the level of expertise that George has as a visual storyteller, as well as an actual writer, scripter, and director.
Yeah, and I would add that it almost seems that for George, that's, if you go back to, and I'm blanking on the name of some of his very, very early student works that were a lot of racing or he had a couple things that were like just time code names, but it was a lot of this quick visual thing. And it honestly seems that is his preferred form of language. That is the thing that's almost like he didn't have to be taught. And I don't know that maybe that's a tie into his early days with racing and mechanics, and that pieces have to fit together to work. You can't just throw together something in an engine and expect it to work. You have to know how the pieces fit together. And once you do, it's like you're fluent. And you can kind of either his fluency was always there or he developed it very quickly. And it's that thing of like, he can, no matter what you ever say about anything he does, that is the thing you can never take away from George Lucas, that he always understands. He ultimately wants to make sure that the pieces fit visually, and everything else, I think, kind of branches off of that. Maybe, I don't know what his personal taste in music and things like that, but the idea you add the music on top of it, and maybe again, like that, maybe dialogue isn't really his favorite thing in the world, but it's like back to what Sean was saying about Darth Vader. You don't need to be told who he is when you see him. Is that I think explicitly in one of these, I was reading one of these newer published Star Wars books, and that he had remarked, somebody had said, George, don't you want to have somebody say, hey, oh, Darth Vader this or Darth Vader that, and very early on, so you establish who he is when he busts through that door. And he's like, no, they're going to know he's the bad guy. They're going to look at him, and the way I'm going to position him and the way the frame I'm going to frame it, it's like the whole sequence happens. There's the carnage of the rebels and all this stuff, and Antilles gets strangled and he gets mad and everything, and then very end, when Leia comes in, then she finally announces him. You know everything that you need to know about Darth Vader before the name Darth Vader is ever even said. It's very much that is his forte, really.
I would also add that George Lucas, it's funny. It reminds me of some stories of some other great artists. But when he was going through the early stages of film school, he was this guy. He was anti-story and anti-dialogue. He would get in fights with his professors about that, and he would say that he was this sort of weird purist in a way about cinema, and he would say things like, films are a visual medium, and we're telling things through your eyeballs, and you don't need words or plots or any of this stuff. We can do it all with pictures. And I think that plot was sort of a loose term. Like, you didn't have to write it down, or you didn't have to spell it out through the dialogue of the characters. You could show somebody where they were supposed to go visually. And it speaks back to his, like some of his student films like Freiheit and the early version of the THX 1138 movie. And these things where he really wanted to be a weirdo poet. Is what he really wanted to be, right? He's from the Bay Area, and he's all in the counterculture movement of the early 60s or mid to late 60s, and talking about, I want to do tone poems in visual. And he used to just fight his professors on it. And finally they were just like, look, dude, maybe for experimental stuff, and maybe for certain short things like commercials or what ultimately winds up becoming music videos and things like that, you can do that. But if you want to make a movie, if you want to make that, you got to do these things. And it's sort of, he came to the dialogue, plotting, and writing portion a little bit late, but he never really let go of that passion for the visual communication of information. And some may argue he never got good at the writing part, but as he got better at the writing part and never letting go of that visual communication piece, it helps make up for some of the lacking portions of his dialogue and things like that. But it only makes that other portion that he puts in there better, because he's already got the visual stuff down. You can have a great writer and a great scripter, but if they don't have a visual sensibility, they're just really literally just writing dialogue. The scene notes are not good. And I think George's scene notes, but he's a guy who came up with previs before previs was even a thing. The fact that he used documentary footage from World War II to, instead of storyboards, he didn't really storyboard a lot of the original Star Wars until much later. he put together these reels of edited dogfighting film and other stuff from old newsreels from World War II to say this is what I want the space battle to look like, and communicating the frenetic energy and the quick movements and all these things. And one of the interviews that I was listening to with him talking about Star Wars, he says, in 1977 when Star Wars came out, it was one of the fastest, breakneck, visually overwhelming movies to come out. He goes, now you watch it 30, 40, 50 years later and you look at it and you're like, this is kind of slow compared to what's happening now. But compared to what came out then, that movie was like, it was a rush. And it was, all these things happening in your face. And it was, again, a choice, a conscious choice that he made. For example, 2001, right? The Kubrick 2001 Space Odyssey, how that movie is extremely slow. It's very tense, right? At points, and it can be very nerve-wracking for the viewer, but it's also very, very slow. There's no fast space action in that movie. And he was like, oh yeah, we're gonna blow that up. This is gonna be like World War II in space, and here's what it's gonna look like. I'm gonna put this film together, and it's gonna show you how the trench run's gonna go, and it's gonna show you how the TIE fighters are gonna look, all this stuff. It was visually overwhelming for people at the time. And now we look at it, we're like, oh, isn't that quaint? These slow motion rotating TIE fighters with the matte framing around them or whatever. But he took all of these visual elements, he took all these things in Hollywood that have been happening, and he repurposed and ratcheted them up, and he made it, I guess, more real time or more realistic. And again, just another thing that came out of this devotion and passion and adherence to the belief that everything that film should do should be done to your eyeballs first.
Yeah, it's almost like if you compare and contrast a 2001 type science fiction experience, which it's a masterpiece, and it's enveloping, and it's a thing where a person can, for the 2.5 hours or whatever, you're just kind of at the 70 millimeter Cinedome or wherever these movies were shown for the first time, and you can kind of have this experience, and it's almost like you're sitting back in your chair and you're experiencing what Kubrick wants you to think about space. But when you sit down and watch the original Star Wars, it's like you probably need to be sitting up in your seat, a little forward in your seat, because it's a difference. Like, you're not having experience, you're going for a ride. And it's like he has that so cranked. And what you were saying about the visual effects, that maybe they're a little quaint they've mostly been replaced now with digital effects, but for almost 20 years, they were the best thing going. I mean, there was no other game in town. It's like, yeah, there was other science fiction movies, but they never really approached. I remember I went and I saw A New Hope probably in 93, 94 they were doing a revival thing one night, and I saw it in a 70 millimeter print. And the trench run, it's like when they kind of convert from the surface and then go into the trench, there's a very abrupt kind of shift of perspective. And it's like, I still would get, especially in a 70 millimeter theater, I would get that little like butterfly in your stomach of like when you go over a bump in a car, and it's like, oh my God, I've seen this movie, and of course at that point it was mostly VHS tapes, or, every couple of years it would come out, you'd see it in the theater. But still, in a proper presentation, it's a roller coaster of a ride of just, it was still very, very, very effective for it took a very, very long time for other people to catch up to what he was doing.
Has Lucas's highly engaging and frankly highly profitable style of visual storytelling been lost in modern cinema?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, that might come down to everybody's own personal opinions on cinema today. More to the point, what a person wants when they go and see a movie like this. I wanted to escape. I wanted to go somewhere else. I didn't want to see a lot of things that reminded me of the world that that existed in the parking lot of the movie theater that I went through to go to this into this theater. And I think that's a lot of the difference about what cinema is like today, is that it's not a experience. Again, 2001, it's like, you went and you had an experience. People love to joke, oh, I dropped an acid and I went and saw 2001. You didn't need it any more than you needed a cup of espresso to enjoy A New Hope. Closest thing you could compare it to is the Marvel experience. And it's like, Marvel is just kind of like, it's spectacle. They're trying to put as much in there as possible, and it's like, because they know people are going to consume these movies more than once. I mean, it's kind of, they're going to be currently now, what is the lead time for a Marvel movie from when it hits the cinema to when you can stream it, is like 45 days or something like that. So people are going to watch this, and they're going to watch it over and over and over again. That's just not an expectation that people had in 1977. It's like you would see Star Wars, and yeah, okay, a lot of people would go multiple times, but most of your public, they'd go and they'd like to go multiple times, but it just didn't make sense. It's like not until the advent of home video. And again, it's a very different experience, but I still say even Star Wars movies don't kind of fall into that same trap of like, well, it's like we're trying to hit a lot of beats. We're trying to satisfy a lot of customers. We're trying to think about the next move of what we've built here. It's well, we've got this movie, but we also know that this is a 2-parter and it's coming out in 9 months. And so, well, how much do we want to put in here now? And it's like, even if George really said, like, ultimately what he always loves to say, and a lot of people have pointed out, just doesn't seem to add up. That's like, oh, I always envisioned it doing like 12 movies or 9 movies or even 3, just 3 movies. I feel like if we're talking about A New Hope or whatever, it's like he left everything on the field at the end of that movie. It's like, it's a complete experience. It's all of Star Wars right then and there. It's like, that's the thing that even Irvin Kershner would try to replicate in certain parts of Empire, but then he couldn't. He had to build on it. And then my point is, everything, the entire lexicon of Star Wars is in that one movie. And even maybe in some regards, Lucas has had trouble trying to replicate it himself. But I think that is the real thing that sets it apart. It's the reason that it's a classic, that for all the conceits, and I can concede that, it is a 44-year-old movie now, and the edge is shown even with his digital upgrades. But look at King Kong, and it's like, and again, wonderful achievement in technology. It's a classic film. I'm not denigrating that, but it feels a bit moldy when you watch it. And it's like, even like Wizard of Oz, which I would say that is the closest to Star Wars in its timelessness, that I remember watching the Wizard of Oz. And even though I knew it was like made in the 30s or whatever, it still captivated, and it still was visually interesting, and it still took me on a ride, and it still felt like it was worth my time to be there. I wasn't, so it's so hard to replicate that. I think as far as Star Wars goes, it's just very and you could go back to his earlier works, THX and American Graffiti. I mean, they're self-contained. They're movies that thematically and story-wise never needed a sequel. I mean, especially if you've seen more American Graffiti, which he wasn't that directly involved in. I think it's just that idea of like, why leave anything kind of in your trick bag? Just put it all out there and get it all out there. And you have to have the confidence that I think George Lucas, ultimately, that is a testament to him as a creator, is that I think he knew, it's like, yeah, I'm leaving everything out there, and I'm going to replenish it for my next thing. I'm not going to hold anything back.
Yeah, and I would say the question about visual cinema and visual storytelling, or the unique approach to the visual spectacle of Hollywood, it is something that has been on the decline for a long time. There's something going on with the general attention span of the world in this 21st century of ours. And I think that the audiences are not tolerant of a certain visual spectacle. People used to complain about the MTV generation. They want everything in nice, tight 5-minute bundles. Well, we're in the TikTok generation. Everybody wants everything in a nice, tight 30-second bundle. Our attention spans are slowing down, which means our media is speeding up, and shorter movies and things are having to become overwhelming. And so I don't know if our cinema going public would be tolerant of a next level auteur like George Lucas, who is trying to tell you a visual story over a 2-hour period. That's sort of the nature of the marketplace. Robert and I have spent a lot of time talking about Denis Villeneuve and the Blade Runner 2049 situation. Probably one of the most beautiful, well-executed science fiction films ever. And I felt it wasn't too long, and there was moments where I kind of felt like it wasn't long enough, because when it was over, I was still wanting more. Nowadays, visual storytelling, beautiful, robust cinema, this epic visual storytelling that requires little or no dialogue, is something that seems to be relegated to art house or stuff that doesn't come out of Hollywood. George talked about when he got the opportunity to make Star Wars, he took advantage of some chaos in Hollywood. The old Hollywood studio system was in chaos because a lot of the people that the studios were named after, like Mr. Goldwyn and Mr. Mayer and Mr. Warner and all those people, they had all died off. And so these things were being bought up by corporations, and there was people being installed, in leadership roles there who weren't old school film people. So they weren't caught up in the power struggles of old Hollywood and all this stuff. And so people like George could sneak in the back door and say, "Hey, I've got an idea for a thing. Will you back it?" He was there at his perfect moment to do a thing. But if George had showed up on the scene 5 years earlier, he wouldn't have got his movie made. And if he had showed up 5 years later, he probably wouldn't have got his movie made. The indulgence of his artistry was allowed because of the timing of when he hit the scene. The artistry of the visual storytelling that, for artists like George Lucas and others, doesn't really hold up to the accountants in the current Hollywood. The people who are funding the development of films are not willing to risk money on an experiential ride, because they think it might not return on their investment. That's why we see every single movie that seems to be coming out as a remake of another earlier successful movie, because they think that if we just put a fresh coat of paint on it and run it back out to the public, we can make our billions back.
Yeah, and I think it's in some ways enjoying cinema that has any kind of artistic leaning or whatever. I know that's kind of a vague term, but it's almost like it's a muscle that the viewer needs to build up, because, when you brought up Blade Runner 2049 and how wonderful that is, I have to fully admit, when I went and saw it in the theater, I was bored, and I don't really enjoy going to the theater anymore just because of all the distractions and whatnot that seem to be. But when I got to watch it at home, I watched it on like 4K Blu-ray or whatever, and I didn't have a big screen, but I had a decent screen. And it's like once you have time, you just get more out of a film like that. And I think that's part of the problem. I think that, a lot of these movies could play, all over the world. I think every audience has a capability. It's just that thing of path of least resistance. Like, people have been programmed to be like, oh no, your time is so precious that, even when you've actually made the decision to sit down and enjoy a movie, that thing isn't dazzling you constantly with high grade excitement, visual excitement. It's not doing its due diligence, and maybe it's the movie's fault that you're bored. And it's like, well, no, maybe it has a little to do about, maybe we should be more patient. People have talked again, about the Dune that's going to be coming out, and that it's kind of a paced, maybe it's a paced a little bit slower than your average Marvel movie. And I'm picking on Marvel, but there is a lexicon of, I'm not saying you have to be like, oh, that's a jump shot and that's a quick dissolve, and I see what they're doing there. I mean, but I think that kind of like itchy irritation that maybe people get when a movie is taking its time to get you where you need to go. It's like you kind of need to go, you kind of have to give into it. And I feel like that's the problem, because, and I don't necessarily think that's the audience's fault. I think it's the studios. I think it's a factor of economics. It's about getting people in and out of that theater every 2 hours, or it's like, oh, don't, you got to stay, because it's like you got to watch 5 minutes into the credits because there's going to be the tease for the next film and what. But and that's all fun, but it's a bit of a Cracker Jack box. It's like, oh, you got your sweet confection, and when you're mid, almost to the bottom, then you got your prize, and you kind of enjoy it. And it's all becomes very superfluous. And I just feel like that's the thing I keep telling myself, like when a movie is maybe not, and again, this isn't really a Star Wars issue, because I mean, like I said, they are fast paced, but when you seem to be irritated with the pacing of a film, it's like, maybe take a second. Have we been almost programmed now to have everything just go by in a flash, and nothing has any gravitas to it? It's just the disposable nature of movies. I just feel like, maybe George wasn't directing every model shot, but he was definitely overseeing that. Those were his notes, and he wanted that. But when somebody gets hired to do Captain Marvel or Ant-Man or whatever, they're kind of hired to do the part where the actors are talking. And everything else, when they're running and jumping and fighting, is done by somebody else, and has been storyboarded 2 years ago and is already being rendered. And it's like, it's not even a creative part of what the filmmaker's doing, because they don't, even if they go at 3 a.m. and go, oh, he should do this. Well, they can't do that. My point is that there's less of a chance for these directors to have a creative stamp. I mean, it's more of a brand kind of situation. Like, they don't, like, oh, well, the Russo brothers are doing it, but what do we really know about the style of the Russo brothers? Or is it just like, well, I like this movie and they other people did it, so when they do something, I know I'm going to like it. It's not so much of a like, oh, well, that's a style choice of that director, and I can really tell that he or she is putting something very important to them in this. It just doesn't feel special.
The irony, and there is irony here, the irony is Hollywood has been trying to duplicate Lucas's success, trying to launch blockbusters and then build franchises based on action, special effects, costumes, toys. But substance, the narrative, the storytelling, the visual pieces that you've mentioned, that's the essence of Star Wars, as Lucas has been telling everyone for 40 plus years. So it's funny in a ridiculous sort of way. Billions upon billions sunk into style, when all along substance is the key. But I want to turn back the clock. Lucas's adolescent passion was auto racing. As a young adult, his future plans shifted from anthropology to independent filmmaking to the U.S. Air Force. His path wandered. At one point, he was creating propaganda for the U.S. government. What aspects of Lucas's childhood through, say, college graduation influenced his writing of Star Wars?
Well, so I guess he grew up in Modesto, and if I'm not mistaken, there was a change in his teenage years of that he lived more centrally in the town, and he lived in kind of a modest house. And then his dad, I don't know, either became more successful or wanted a different life, and actually moved the family to the outskirts of town. And in some really odd way, it kind of, George, I don't know what age he was, but it kind of isolated him, I think, from a lot of people. It became, I think he maybe didn't have a car at that point. I can't imagine what, a young person, and again, I guess George is in his late 70s, so he was born in the 40s. So he's kind of like that first early generation of what culturally in America would be like the first teenagers. I mean, I know there's teenagers obviously have existed, but the idea that there was free time, to have some options of following pursuits or of interest. It wasn't like a situation where somebody would be expected to necessarily, when they weren't in schooling, working a full-time job to support the family. Maybe people had part-time jobs and whatnot, but these are young people that for the first time had a lot of freedom and not a lot of responsibility. And there was a lot of change in the country in the 50s. The idea that the mass production of automobiles, I mean, it was within the reach of a young person, an industrious young person, to be able to buy an automobile and be able to go out and explore and race and take chances and see the world not through how long your mom and dad would put up with, wanting to do something, or like you didn't have to ask, you could just go out. So that it kind of opens up this realm of possibilities. But if at some point you had access to people, and then that was taken away by a geographic change, which in some regard, if I remember right, was kind of a Lucas's father's, well, I've become successful and now I don't have to live in town. I can have some space, and it's a sign of success or a sign of like a change in perspective. But again, for a young person, that's like you're cutting them off. And so I guess the only antidote to that is the idea of getting a car and going out. And again, that leads to racing, and it leads to the mechanics, and you learn the responsibility of maintaining a vehicle like that, because generally it was not a situation where you'd have a car and you'd be dropping it off at the place and they'd fix it. It's like, you didn't have a lot of money, so you would have to figure it out yourself. And so I think a lot of that is that might have come to the point of where George had this opportunity to solve a problem of how to get out and interact with other young people or whatever. I don't know what his social circle was really like, but it's that, very quickly a person, when they have to be responsible for changing their own situation, it's like for a long time he was obviously very aimless, in that's the mythos of George and his early dalliances with car racing, and it just kind of being like, well, he just really enjoyed speed. And I'm sure there was a social aspect to that, and it builds confidence if you're good at that. And then obviously the big part of his story is that his accident that kind of changed that direction in his life. But for that time, it's like I think he had to quickly learn that if he didn't like what was being offered to him by his home life, then it up to him to make a change in that. And I think that could lead to a lot of things, of a lot of realms of possibility for these first, second generation teenagers of realizing, well, I'm not necessary at the time when this is late 50s, is like the thought of being drafted into the army isn't really a thing. There's not really it wasn't an immediate idea that like, oh, I'm going to be drafted into the army, so I'm just kind of dork around until I end up going into the service. Because a lot of people would do that, was their way out of a situation like, I don't want to have to be on the farm. I'm bored on the farm. I'm bored with my town. They join the military. Well, for the first time, you could kind of get that same taste of freedom by buying a car, and you could sleep in your own bed, and mom could still cook for you and whatnot. So it's like, I think a lot of that is that kind of idea that it's a weird jump to go from like somebody that works in a stationery store of his dad's stationery store to being like, well, I want to make films that depict a futuristic society where people are completely drugged out into servitude. It's that jump to George's very strict, strong work ethic dad, probably like, oh, George is just jerking around. He's not really doing anything with himself. But in some strange way, he was going out and just trying things on, and that's a kind of a luxury that really, up until that generation in America at least, wasn't really something that was afforded to people. And I think he took it by the reins, and it's almost the archetype of the rural young man who just looks over that horizon of the sun and on the farm or whatever, and they look out and he goes, this is great, but there's got to be a lot more. I want to do more. I'm engaged. I don't know what that is, but I want to do more.
I would absolutely concur with all of that. The whole situation with George Lucas growing up, I mean, up to the point of his accident, he's basically Luke Skywalker, right? He's a kid who likes to go fast, who is living, in a situation that is removed from the bright center of whether it be society or the city or where the quote unquote action is or where the people are. He's removed from all of that. He's found an outlet for expression through racing cars and mechanics and things like that. And in his mind, that was going to be his path up to the point of him again having a near fatal car accident. So his life experience, I mean, Star Wars, if you do read some of the the biographies of George Lucas and you listen to some of the interviews, and I will say, as I watched a lot of George Lucas's interviews recently in preparation for this, I found that I can't really trust a lot of what Lucas tells us now later in life in his interviews, because he's a person who's very cognizant and protective of his legacy, and to use the word that Robert used earlier, his own mythos or his own mythology and the way that he's going to be remembered in posterity. So some of these things changed, but if you go back farther, and if you also read some of the interviews of people who knew him, Star Wars actually turns out to be on one level or at least the first Star Wars film, in a weird way is very autobiographical. George being a boomer, the post-World War II baby boom, being in that first generation of American teenagers who were afforded the luxury of free time that Robert had discussed. He's a guy who spent a lot of time thinking about where he was and where he wanted to go. But in the first portion of that, before the accident, his where I am, where I want to be, where I want to go, his scope or his ambition felt very small. And then a catastrophic event happens in his life, the car accident. Then suddenly there's a larger purpose. There's more of a global vision, or more of a over the horizon view of life that George is now experiencing. This is when he decided he really was going to focus on his academic pursuits, because he spent a lot of time in the hospital after the wreck, and really all he could do was read and do schoolwork and things like that. He was no longer in the physical realm, so to speak, or the mechanical realm that he had been living in up to that point. And it broadened his mind, it broadened his horizons, and it got him into this hobby of photography, and then doing a lot of this reading, and then having ambitions to go to college, which he had not had up to that point. He was going to finish high school and become a mechanic and race on the weekends for fun, and that was pretty much, he was content with that, that idea up to that point. And then once this thing happened, he says this now in interviews, and I don't know if this is some polished public relations thing that he's on about, but it's relatable and understandable and believable. But to say that when you have something like that happen in your life, if you get another day, it's extra time, it's a bonus, it's a gift, and then the day after that is another gift, right? And so whether it's something he says now in hindsight is a 70-something-year-old guy talking about his success, or if it's actually something he believed in the moment, but the results bear out that this might be true, is that he sort of realized that he's got some extra time, and that time is precious, and that it shouldn't be wasted on, you can waste time with your friends later, right? That he wanted to do something more with his life. And I think that's where a lot of this autobiographical portion of the character of Luke Skywalker comes out in George Lucas's youth. At one point he's on the farm, he's working on the farm, and he kind of wants to do something else, but he's okay with the farm because it's important and it's family and it's these things. And then the tragic event happens, and he's actually exposed to a larger worldview. There's something going on outside, off of your farm. There's something going on outside of your village. There's something going on even beyond your continent or your planet. And I think George, his awakening as a young man, really kind of coincides with sort of the Luke Skywalker situation, which of course then builds into the larger the Campbell monomyth thing. You know, there has to be status quo, and then there has to be a tragedy, and then you know whatever, then you figure it out and you have triumph. It's a universal theme, but it's a thing that definitely his youth. His father wanted him to follow in his footsteps, right? His father wanted him to be the next general manager of, you know, Lucas Stationery or whatever, and it didn't appeal to him. And this is again another universal theme: fathers and sons in conflict, and what the parent wants for the child, and what the child wants for the child, and that tension, and like all these things, like all his life is played out on some level in Star Wars. Like everything that he experienced growing up in some way informs some character in the saga that he wrote and produced, you know, over 6 films. Maybe this is me being overly poetic or whatever, but I mean, him being in this car accident, being hospitalized is, you know, is akin to the deformation of Anakin Skywalker and the turning into Darth Vader. Not that Lucas, you know, lost limbs or whatever, but it's like that catastrophic injury that takes significant time to recover from, and, you know, and it changes you as a person. You know, all these things, you know, they all come together in some way in Star Wars. And so I think that, you know, his youth and his life and all the crazy things that he got involved with, and he touches on or uses as a resource in his creative ambitions. Now, I think for like THX, things like that starts to be more of a young man in Southern California going to a university in a time of cultural upheaval, you know, with the 60s and the counterculture and all that stuff, and the anti-war movement and all those things, and him, you know, not being far from San Francisco, which was sort of the epicenter of that movement during the Vietnam era. The THX thing, I believe, comes out of that. I think it comes out of his youth, you know, and again, these are all terms we throw on, you know, the radical movement or whatever, you know, whatever you want to call it, from that era. Now he's in the university, he's being exposed to all these ideas. He's, you know, talking about governments and tyranny and war and society and all that stuff. I mean, that was his first commentary in THX was about that. And again, some of that carried forward again into Star Wars with the Empire and the Rebellion. And, you know, he's often referred to the rebels as the Viet Cong and the Empire as the U.S. government, and, you know, and as a de facto commentary on the Vietnam War that he was experiencing as a youth when he was in film school and all that stuff. So yeah, his entire life and all of his experiences and his real-time geopolitical awakening and education and all these things have all played into the entire saga that he wrote in Star Wars.
Hard to find any really good information, you know, about George's like home life, except for that one story that, again, it's, I don't know how true it is, but it's popped up, and I think it was in the, you know, the first George Lucas biography, which was Skywalking by Pollock, when he wanted to go to film school or whatever, and it's like his dad didn't want him to. I can't remember what he would have preferred him, but he said something like, well, I'm going, and it's like, I'm going to be a millionaire by the time I'm 30. And it's the stories I've heard, at least I've read about again, them buying this house out in the outskirts, this big old house. It's like, I don't think it was a situation that George had a lot of deprivation of material things. That I don't know what he wanted or didn't want. I mean, he obviously had a car, and he had a job, and he probably had his walking around and his hamburger money or whatever. But I mean, I think that's, again, tying back into this teenager thing of like, and maybe it's just projection about remembering about what it was to be like. Well, you know, you're 16, you're 17. It's like, you know, your parents are making a horrible demands. They want you to show up and help with the family business. But again, it's like this whole wide world. It's like TV is starting. And then obviously, I don't know if TV itself was a big thing for George. I know movies were even, I don't know if he was enamored with the art of filmmaking, but he definitely liked to watch movies. And it was there was definitely, movies to be watched for a dime or whatever. And maybe that kind of gave him this wanderlust of like, well, I know I have everything I need, but I want more. I want to see what else is out there, because it's like, George's dad, I'm sure I think I do remember that I think his father, the whole reason he got that business is that he had taken over a family business where the man that owned the business maybe didn't have a son or that was interested in the business, or didn't even have somebody that wanted to take it over. And again, I'm sorry if I'm for listeners if I'm remembering this wrong, but I'm sure that was kind of like a person that probably grew up remembered the Depression and remembered what it was like when so many people were unemployed, and to just basically I worked hard and I came in, I have this business now, and maybe it's not my family business, but it could be a family business. And I think parents don't want their children to suffer or struggle. And it's like, well, this is easy. If I could have had, my father could have given me a business, George, I would have taken it. And I can just imagine what's that weird thing because they talk about, economically intergenerational wealth. It's like it generally, when a parent becomes quite wealthy, it seems almost the same story that like the next generation, if they inherit that, they just squander it. It doesn't make it another generation. And it's kind of like, I don't know what his father's financial situation was before this, but it's that thing of like, why would you struggle? Why would you want to go out for something that, I need you here and I need you now? Again, it's like the Uncle Owen situation where he's very much, why you got your head in the clouds? I've been out there. It sucks. Stay here in Modesto. You can meet a nice girl. You can have a life. I did. It's great. That kind of thing. And again, as attractive as that sounds to a lot of people, it's like that baby boomer, that generation, it's like there was, maybe it's the media, maybe it's what the movies are putting out, maybe it's the magazines, maybe it's the music, maybe it's the access to cars, cheap automobiles and free time and whatever. It just somehow just doing what you're supposed to be doing. It doesn't seem like such a gift to a young person when there's so many different things going out there. There's, the racing and the competition and the flattery of being fast, being able to drive fast. People, there's probably George Lucas is probably like, oh, that's George. Like, did you see him last weekend? He's so great in the car. And I'm sure that in some regards that kind of feeds the ego. And you're like, well, that feels good. Like, what else can I do? Just the idea of like, well, you need to come back and make sure all the double bond paper is arranged and we're not going to run out and da da da. It's like, it just feels like drudgery. It feels like the moisture evaporators. It feels like I want to go out and do something, but dad's turning the power off and I got to go to bed. And it's like, I got to go to bed at 9 because we live out in the sticks. I think it's just one of those situations with, in some ways, it's a generational divide. It's very hard for one generation to impart the wisdom of their wisdom to the next generation. I mean, I wonder in some regards, George has 3 children and, he has so much money, and he's been very adamant in interviews. Well, that's not their money. That's my money. I'm not giving them any money. And I don't know how much of that is just for the press and how much is it something is like, yeah, you're not getting anything from me. But I'm pretty sure that George probably did benefit from his father's success, but maybe he feels, maybe I'd been even better if I hadn't had that. It's that kind of the frisson between the generations provides the motivation to try to achieve a little bit more than what's right in front of you.
I too have not found any real documentary evidence as to the nature or the tone of the home life at the Lucas household. But, Robert has spoken at length and eloquently about what that whole situation looked like based on what we've read, the father owning the business and wanting the son to move into the business, and the whole generational question of, do I stay here in town and do the family thing and the obligation, or do I answer the call to move beyond this horizon and grow and become my own person? I'm pretty sure conversations in the Lucas household were not unlike the conversations in my household growing up. My father was of the Great Depression generation. He was a World War II veteran, and his idea of success was a very specific path to follow. Growing up on a farm in Kansas and paid nothing and earning nothing and having nothing and making something of himself. His idea of success was you went to college and you got a business degree, or you became a doctor or a lawyer. You got a degree that would produce wealth or that would produce job prospects. So when you say things like, I would like to go to college and study art, things are said, why would you want to do that? That's a waste of time. There's no money in it. There's no future in it. The fact that he wanted to study anthropology, whether or not George initially wanted to study art, but I'm pretty sure that someone from the Great Depression generation would look at that and say, why? Or what's the point? Or what the hell is anthropology? I'm sure that there was a lot of tension in the Lucas household. George having the dubious, honor of being the only male child in the family. I'm sure his father, again, being of a certain generation, placed a lot of pressure on George as the next generational patriarch and his responsibilities therein. And so, yeah, I can see maybe George's rebellion streak or fascination with rebellion, as the case may be, is well-founded and personal. Pretty sure that things weren't as good as they could have been. Again, it's replete throughout the history of humankind, but fathers and sons, and the father's expectation of the son, and the son's either success or failure in living up to them, and what that means for the son. Sometimes, through a happy coincidence, that when a father wants something for their son in their life, and the son also wants the same thing, things are great. But when it doesn't work, you have people who maybe embark on that path to appease the parent, which they ultimately become unhappy and disaffected, and then feel like they've wasted their life, or they finally get to truly be themselves when that parent passes away, and there's all that inherent guilt and all that stuff that goes with it. Or you have that in the moment blow up where George is shouting at his dad saying he's going to be a millionaire, and that feels like a very honest teenage response to a parent saying to them, why would you want to go to college and do that? You're not going to make any money in that. The money is in heavy bond copier paper, okay? And if we sell the high-end resume paper to the people out getting jobs, we're going to get rich. That the father may have not had the vision. His success was, how many units did we sell? How many more units can we sell next month? Do we open a branch office in the next town? That kind of stuff. It was a very localized idea of success. And I think George, being a teenager and having the ability to dream and want, he had mentioned in a couple of the interviews that I watched, and it's something that I hadn't really heard mentioned or written before, where he had talked about how he wanted to become an anthropology professor. He had the initial ambition to become a college teacher. I don't think that would have necessarily been a big deal, but a lot of that stuff felt a little too risky and a little too flowery. I'm surprised that his father was not necessarily on board with, or maybe he was on board with, but then when George abandoned the idea of becoming a mechanic, it started making weird. But, having a skill, having a trade, or having a good thing like this established family business, these were real, tangible assets that would help you through hard times. And, I'm sure that, like any parent, they have this moment where they're like, well, when it all hits the fan and society collapses and there's massive economic depression, the guy that can grow food or fix cars or heal people is probably going to be doing just fine. The guy who teaches anthropology at the local community college is going to be screwed. So I can see where everything gets glossed over, of course, right? We have this commercialized, packaged George Lucas history that has been refined, and you can read 10 different biographies, and you can watch the interviews with George, where back in the day he used to say stuff in the 80s and 90s, but now, as we get now into the 2020s, it's all the interviews are the same, and he says the same thing. He's branded himself, he's polished the branding, and now he delivers what he wants us to know. But I can see how the youth of George might not have necessarily been idyllic or happy at a certain point.
In the relationship with his father, I can see influences for both Uncle Owen and Darth Vader at different periods in different discussions. Both of those characters are present in his actual relationship with his father. And this is great, by the way. Of course, every time someone mentions Bond copy paper, I'm laughing my head off. But the least exciting part of this discussion, just some quick geography, which kind of reinforces the idea of Modesto as Tatooine and not exciting. So Modesto is located in Central Valley in Northern California. It's only 80 miles northeast of San Jose and about 90 to 100 miles outside Oakland and San Francisco. And having lived in the Bay Area, the mileage really doesn't tell the story, because the Pacific Coast Range separates the Bay Area from Modesto, and it delineates the Central Valley. And in the Central Valley, particularly in the time that George was growing up, Modesto is a city, but not really a city in the way we think about it growing up in Modesto. Small. You talked about his father and the focus of the stationery store. If you have a business in Modesto, you're not going to have a lot of expansion opportunities. I don't know. I feel like the geography definitely shaped Lucas's opinions and views, and certainly his childhood, and probably lit a spark. I want to get out of here and get on to bigger and better things. Okay. I think the geography matters.
Isn't it ironic, though, that the minute he made a buck, he moved out to Marin County and got the heck out of LA? He was just, he may have wanted bigger and bolder things, but when he got what he needed from them, he retreated back to a more isolated experience. It's almost, the ranch is really not that different than it's the writ large version of the Lucas family home in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of, at a certain age, you're just like, oh, wait, I got what I wanted, breaking away from the Modesto, and now I'm going to go back to, not to Modesto, but I'm going to go back to I'm going to find my a more aesthetically pleasing kind of situation than before, but still kind of like not the bright lights of the city for George.
Yeah, that's true. Landscape's different. Marin is on the coast, and it's beautiful, and the ranch is nestled in these rolling hills. It's not flat and dry like Central Valley, but yes, point taken. And Marin has only recently been developing, but having lived just a few miles away from the ranch, yeah, you would drive the road with the ranch. It's not a main road. It climbs and winds and twists, and honestly, if you don't know it's there, you're going to drive right past it. You miss it entirely. You won't even see the gate. There's definitely that element of privacy and isolation there.
As the son grows older, he becomes the father, right? I'm wondering if maybe one of the reasons why George's father moved out a little bit out of town, not only as a symbol of the wealth, right, like George moving to the ranch in Marin, but there's also probably a little bit of what George was experiencing as becoming a celebrity. It sounds like George's dad might have been a recognizable figure in the community, someone in town as a business owner. I don't want to say a mover and a shaker, but definitely someone elevated and recognizable in the community. And maybe he just wanted a little bit of privacy. It's funny to see the parallels here, that George, like Robert said, he fights and fights and fights to get off the farm, and then be careful what you wish for, right? Your dreams may come true. And then now you just can't wait to get back out there into the silence and the isolation of the farm, because you need that to rejuvenate and rest and recover from your work, gather your thoughts, find peace. It's funny, there's the old, I think it's a Mark Twain quote that says, "When I was young, my father was an idiot, but as I got older, it amazed me how smart he got." Again, another timeless tale of life. When we're young and rebellious, we think we know it all, and then we realize, that the elders were right all along, because now we're one of them.
Yeah, we realize as we leave adolescence, our parents, they're not wrong about everything. One last interesting piece of the geography puzzle here. The exit to get to the ranch is the Lucas Valley exit, but it's not named after George. And a lot of people coming to the area as Star Wars fans assume that it's called Lucas Valley because George Lucas is there, but it was actually inherited by a man of the same last name in the mid 19th century. So anyway.
The question is, does George know that?
What do you mean? What do you mean? I thought you named it after. Why did I move here if you didn't name it after me?
Well, it was certainly convenient.
Yeah, I just need to find a town named Sean to move to, right?
There you go. Absolutely. All right. Within the same time period, there's a lot to talk about with the social sciences, but USC and the School of Cinematic Arts and the people that he will meet and the films that he will watch and some weird things also with the draft lottery for Vietnam and being rejected by the Air Force. This period is just rich in influences for Star Wars.
Did he apply to be in the Air Force, or did he think he was going to be drafted? And he
the draft lottery for Vietnam occurred after.
Okay.
So it's really strange to have these great experiences at film school, graduate, and want to enroll in the Air Force.
Well, maybe, and again, I don't know what the timing is on all that stuff, but at the time when Lucas was first looking at doing film, this was still the studio era was still in full effect, or at the very least was just starting to come to an end, and it hadn't really fully realized its own demise yet. It was a very nepotistic business. You didn't get a job in film for the most part unless you were either related to someone or knew someone or you were rich enough to buy someone. A lot of people, when George was talking about going to film school, were saying, well, who do you know down there? Like, who do you know in Hollywood? You're never going to get a job, right? And a lot of people, you didn't go to film school to get a job in film in Hollywood because of that system that was in place. And so people who were going to get film degrees were going to go into industrial filmmaking. They're going to go work for companies that made training films or go to large corporations that made their own internal documentaries or made sales films or HR films or whatever. But also the military was a large producer of film content, especially, during World War II, we saw a lot of that, but just in general, training films, quote unquote, educational films for the troops, whatever, things that would be released to the press for recruiting, for public consumption. Look at the military today, look at what we're doing and this and that, right? So there's a very real possibility that George may have had a moment of self-doubt and realized that I just went to college and got a degree in something that is only marketable in a couple of places, and figured that getting ahead of the draft, because you went through the lottery once while you were in college and you were deferred because you were in college, once you graduated, you could have just been thrown right back in and just gone through officer school. So maybe he was trying to get ahead of some kind of in-theater deployment, and by enrolling in the military and going into the communications/propaganda division or whatever you called it, where they made films for the military, like he's already coming with his own credential. It might be a way for him to try and get ahead of the least desirable option, being sent into a theater of war.
Maybe the Air Force enrollment is that last ditch attempt to please Dad, to show Dad that you're willing to do something productive with your life, at least in Dad's eyes. But his experiences at film school are, it's incredible. The names that come out of his experiences there. Through an internship, he meets and becomes friends with Francis Ford Coppola. he'll cross paths with Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, Howard Kazanjian, Dan O'Bannon, John Carpenter. The name dropping could literally go on and on, but this crew, I mean, they will. Is it an overstatement to say that they will take over Hollywood for the 20 years that follow?
No, I wouldn't say that. That's pretty spot on. I mean, and even like James Caan, who I get not the from The Godfather, but James Caan that wrote the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back was another classmate. Caleb Deschanel, who was a cinematographer and the father of Zoe, and it's almost like the first teenagers or whatever. There was a lot of guys that did not want to work in Dad's shop. And I don't know the biographies of all these people, but it just seemed like, I mean, just the idea of going to like quote film school seems even 20 years on from that, 30 years on from that, it's like, really, film? I mean, what it must have been a nice combination of access to this kind of training. It's like the idea that it was even around, a lot of times that you had to have known somebody in the business to get in the business. So it's kind of an interesting time. So many people were like, well, I don't care, I'm going to try. And a lot of these, John Carpenter, Dan O'Bannon made student films and made them into full features later on. It was like, well, why not? Why not try? And that seems to be very indicative of that generation of being like, well, why not me? Even like John Milius. John Milius was very much wanted to go to Vietnam. Apparently, it's like I remember reading interviews about him where he kind of would very cavalierly refer to like, well, and I don't remember why he was disqualified from service, but he's like, well, I would have went to Vietnam and I would have died. It's like he had thought that was his path. His path was going to be like, well, I want to fight in a war and I want to die. And instead, instead of doing that, he fell into screenwriting and directing. It's a very, very strange time where it seems like it was a perfect storm of opportunity and a lot of motivated young men that really wanted to be in an industry at the time when it was like, there was John Ford and Orson Welles, but it wasn't. I don't know if I don't really. It doesn't seem to me that there was a huge culture of cinema at the time where it was like, a lot of these people actually created what led to this whole idea of people spending countless hours discussing the merits of movies, other than going to a quick, some Kurosawa type stuff at a revival theater or whatnot. I don't know. And maybe it was just a fact that was the predominant form of entertainment, television, even though it was becoming ubiquitous. Whatever radio shows now turned into live action, it doesn't offer a lot of interest for a teenager or a 20-something. So maybe that was the idea of like going out and Francois Truffaut films and I mean, I'm no film expert from that era, but I don't think there was a lot of people like discussing directors and techniques and stuff. So it's really interesting that seemed to come together, that confluence of a lot of people, which has gone on that a lot of these people's careers have intertwined over the years too. So it's almost like they felt like they were, it was almost like a shared experience. Makes you wonder if what kind of job options were there for a film student coming out. If you, like I said, you weren't in the family, you're not going to be in the business. And it's at that point, it's like, obviously he never did enlist, but maybe he would move in and do those propaganda films, but somehow he got subcontracted to do that. It's interesting. I wonder if anybody knows any of those films that he's worked on, if they're in existence anywhere. I didn't even know this until a couple of years ago that he had been a cameraman at the Altamont Speedway the day of the infamous Rolling Stones show where the
Hells Angels,
and the Hells Angels. But he was very like, he was not in the mix. He was on a hill basically filming the crowd. It wasn't like he was the guy that filmed the close up on the Stones or anything like that. But I just wonder if how much of this is just, I got to find some work. It's that kind of hand to mouth situation once you're done with school. And then I don't know how he funded his education, if his father didn't approve of it, did that mean that he withheld money and he had to self-finance, or it was just a Lucas senior financed it under duress, and he maybe when it was over he was like, well, you're going to have to find some way to either make your living or pay me back or whatever. And it was like, he quickly ran up against the idea of like, well, I'll just do anything.
Going back to high school and the accident, watching, reading the interviews, hearing what Lucas has to say, the accident feels like the turning point. But in doing the research on his life, I feel like the turning point, the real turning point, comes much later.
Almost like a tradesman view of cinema rather than the auteur version of it. It's like, well, I just want to run a camera for somebody, or that kind of like, I just want to get a gig so I can be the guy behind the camera. I don't care what I'm doing. I don't know if he'd already formed a view of like, well, I have this. I mean, so that THX 4EB, I mean, what year was that made?
It's 67 or 68. So he graduates in 67. He's rejected by the Air Force, and then he re-enrolls at USC as a graduate student.
Oh, okay.
He gets involved with the U.S. Information Agency, the propaganda, and it's at that point THX 1138. So it's 67 or 68.
I'm trying to remember what year he met Francis Ford Coppola.
He gets an opportunity to choose a film that he wants to work on, and he chooses Finian's Rainbow, which is Coppola's project, and then the two become friends. So it's right there in that same time frame. That's 68.
It's like amazing how much faith that Francis had in him very quickly. Francis was such a force to be reckoned with that it would very much orientate your interests. What are you into, George? I don't know. I just like these kind of movies. Like, well, you should like this. And then all of a sudden he's like, okay, well, then all of a sudden it's like he gets now that college is done, his schooling begins, because it's like that. It was almost like a Coppola thing was almost like a patronage in some regards.
A year later, they're founding an independent studio. Now, obviously, they are friends. But again, in doing the research, I can't get a sense. Coppola's the older man. He's somewhat established, and he's certainly more of a mentor when they first meet. But then they're co-founding an independent studio. I mean, that's a lot of confidence that Coppola's showing in Lucas. And to your point about the influence, yeah, Coppola might he might be steering George. I mean, for his own good, but he might be steering George in terms of the political opinions and the foreign influences. It's hard to say.
Yeah. Coppola just liked George immediately because he was the only other young person on that shoot. What are you doing? I was like, I'm just seeing what's going on. He's like, well, come over here and help me with this. And that's kind of where it started. It's like that internship thing where he was like, well, you get to come on the set and find some place and maybe we'll find some work for you. And it's all it took was like, well, you're young, I'm young, let's do something. And then it became like this thing because of what happened with THX and it kind of not making money. And that was supposed to be the first thing out of the gate. And then they reorientated it. And I guess Francis kind of did The Godfather because he kind of needed a hit. He needed to make an impression, and he didn't really want to do The Godfather. I'm not the world's biggest fan. I like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now and stuff like that, but I don't think I've ever seen Finian's Rainbow or The Rain People or any of those ones.
The same for me. I respect the filmmaking, the films that you mentioned, certainly familiar with those. Dracula from the early 90s. If we can separate the technical and the artistic from the rest, you can see Coppola's genius. He's doing things and seeing things that just other people don't. That's it. It's amazing. I don't know.
Yeah, Keanu's not great in that.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah, he's kind of like,
I'm traveling to Budapest.
It's Bill and Ted meet Dracula.
Yeah. And turning Dracula into a love story, and the monster into a sympathetic figure. I mean, it's a take. It's not a take that appeals to me, but ahead of its time.
Actually, I enjoy it. It's, I'm not a horror film person or whatnot, and not that really qualifies as a horror movie, but I watch that movie every year at Halloween. It's fantastic. But that's Coppola though, right? I mean, Godfather 2, two of the top 10 films of all time. So him and Lucas working together, it's like you say, that it only took 1 year for them to go from internship to independent studio. But what I was going to mention earlier, the group of people that Lucas interacted with and met and that were coming out of this film scene, Coppola and Milius and everybody, Spielberg and the list, is a really interesting moment in time. And film schools at that point were not really a thing yet. They were a newer idea because of the way the film industry itself got started. It was this new technology that people were learning to work with and be creative with. And then the studio system gets created, and we have contract players, and we have people signed to multi-picture deals, and we have backlots and all this stuff. And it becomes this almost industrial process to factory. You have the Western lot, out in the valley, right? We got a bunch of horses and we got a small village, and we film our cowboys and Indian movies out there. And then we've got behind the main soundstage, we've got a street that looks like, a street in New York, and we got another street that looks like a street in suburbia. And it was a very tight, controlled system. We had the A list and the B list, and all these terms that we use now came out of that. You had your primary players and you had your secondary players, and then you had your senior level directors, and you had the up and coming guys, and the up and coming guys would get the B list stuff, and then if they proved to be good, they might move up to A list. And same thing with the actors and all that stuff. Ronald Reagan got his start as a corpse. Literally his screen test or whatever, they had him laid out with a sheet over him, and he was being extra in a thing. And then at the end of the take from a scene, they pull the cloth back on him. He sits up, and somebody in the preview room was like, "Hey, that guy looks pretty good. We should put him on that one picture with that one lady next week." And that's kind of how it worked. The thing where everybody showed up and they were given these jobs and brought into this almost apprenticeship situation, and it was strictly on who you knew or who you related to, and then again, or if you had enough money to get yourself in there. And so the film school idea was something that probably somebody came up with, saying, well, there's this other applications for film, and if we can train competent cameramen and editors and maybe even script writers or whatever. We did have the TV industry that was now starting to come into full bloom in the 60s. So now we're kind of thinking of it as almost as a trade school idea versus an art school idea. But you have this group of people who are already in California in the late 60s as part of the counterculture movement and as a very politically active group of people, very much concerned and focused on art and creativity and the artistic impulse. Perhaps the USC Film School was kind of taken in a direction by the students. But then you have this group of people that came together, and it's such an intense gathering of such highly talented and ultimately wind up being very influential people in Hollywood and in the film industry at large. It's almost like the founding fathers or whatnot, right? It's like a bunch of people who came together at just the right time and the right moment to meet one another, interact one another, share ideas, encourage one another, promote one another, and support one another within having one foot in the counterculture movement and another foot in this industrial art making thing known as Hollywood. Lucas talks a lot about it in his interviews, and I think that some of it is embellished a little bit, clearly based on the things we're talking about here about whether or not he made propaganda for the government and whether or not he was going into the military and whatnot. But these people all sort of had a chip on their shoulder, and they were all very much the underdog because they knew they were outsiders to the system. And while they may talk a good game about fighting the man and not being, not wanting to be a part of that, they say all that now, and that, and that looks good on their resumes and it looks really great in their biographies and makes for fun interviews. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of these people deep down, their desire was to be a part of that because it has cachet and it has social standing, and they feel important, and they're minor celebrities and things like that. So this forming your own studio, sort of in contravention to or in defiance of Hollywood, is not. I think that a lot of this political stuff with George comes. It seems like George comes to everything late. If you listen to him give interviews, he didn't want to be a filmmaker. He had no idea of going to film school. He had no idea of making movies. He would occasionally go out to the racetrack and shoot some high-8 film, and he was interested in photography and things like that. But ultimately his thing was cars. And then he decided, oh, well, I also like reading about cultures and psychology and things like that, so I'll go to college for that. He gets to college, he meets people, he gets introduced to people, he gets direction making films. But he's not like he comes to that late. Like he's like, oh, film's kind of cool because not only can I use my interest in photography and visual media, but I can also use my interest in history, and I can use my interest in anthropology and psychology, and I can put all these things together and package it into something that conveys all my interests. It's a nice intersectional repository for all of my hobbies, right? And some of his early student films were just him going out to like the Laguna Seca Raceway and filming guys racing cars on the weekend. And he's like, ooh, student film number 12. It's, a guy racing MG Sprites. And it's like, okay, great. Is that a film? No. But, you shoot it in black and white at a weird angle, and you enhance the sound, and you don't have any dialogue or anything. And people are like, ooh, it's art house, right? And now it would be like B-roll for the Speed Channel, but he's combining all these passions into a thing. But again, he came to filmmaking very late. It wasn't his initial idea. And I think the same thing with his politics. You're talking about a guy who managed to get through the University of Southern California in the height of the Vietnam War, and still at the end, after graduating, is considering joining the military. So there was some insulation there to a lot of the counterculture, even though he was part of the counterculture. I mean, he had long hair and a beard, and he was making movies. But other than Milius that we talked about, most of the people in the creative community in California in the 60s didn't want to be within 1,000 miles of the military. So again, the politics, and I would agree that probably the exposure to Coppola and those other people at American Zoetrope, when they founded it, accelerated George's change and turn. And the fact that this studio was founded in San Francisco now in 1968, 69, that era, the Summer of Love, Woodstock and all that stuff, like the height of the counterculture anti-war movement in the United States, he probably kind of felt like, yeah, this is pretty cool. I'm here in the heart of it. So he was probably getting all the free love and whatever else he wanted. And now he could tell people that he's the founder of a studio. Unfortunately, their first film was the THX film, and it bankrupted them, and then they all had to go back to work for the studios, and that was the great irony, that they all wound up having to go do something else to make the money so they could recover from the failure that was George Lucas's first major studio film, or first major production, shouldn't say studio film, first major production. And that whole being involved with the government thing as a graduate student probably is one of those deals where we see this now with a lot of things, but the government will contract universities and their research departments to do things for them. Perhaps it was a subcontracting situation, the SC Film School. So I could see how George would be involved in that, especially if it's paying for his tuition / living arrangements, or maybe giving him a slight stipend while he's a grad student in college.
So he meets his future wife while creating propaganda for the U.S. government. He meets Marcia at the time, Griffin, and they are actually married in 69. So this period in George Lucas's life, wow, the times they are changing. 67 to 69, married, has an independent film studio, struggling. Yeah.
I would say the speed that all that stuff happened, from things I've seen in various documentaries and interviews with folks who were movers and shakers in the counterculture in the late 60s, there was definitely a feeling that this was kind of the future is uncertain. Take advantage of the day. We live in this weird time, and there's war, and there's, Nixon's president and all this stuff. I could see why, like, a lot of these guys are just, we're making this studio today, and then George meets a girl and he likes her and she likes him, and they're together and they're like, we should get married now. Me looking at my life, I'm of a certain age and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, and then I'm looking at George and it's like, you've graduated from college, you've founded a studio, you've gotten married, you've done all these things. It's all been like within 18 months. It feels fast in hindsight, but I don't know. It feels also like it could be a product of the atmosphere of the era and the area in which they were living.
Definitely. And 68 is one of the most turbulent, tumultuous years in U.S. history. And so coming out the other side of it, that live for today, do it now, sha la 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 la. Get it done. Yeah, you could understand. So as far as Lucas's experiences at film school, he talks about developing his love for cinema and not being exposed to foreign cinema in particular prior to coming to film school. And he's encountering Kurosawa. He already loves Westerns, but now he's looking at them with different eyes. And he talks about the mythology of the American West, and that's definitely an influence on Star Wars. Anything that kind of stands out from this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that had to have been the exposure of like a Kurosawa, because I mean, it seems like it has been, that looms so large in his backstory of what kind of formed his interest in cinema. I mean, yeah, that's not the kind of stuff that would show up on late night TV or the Modesto cinema. I assume. I think when you're that age and you're kind of primed and you're in this convivial scene, which I don't know if how much, it's amazing that all those people were there at the same time. I don't know what the relationships with them were. If it was just like, oh, we occupied the same space, we had the same teachers, or did they go out for coffee? Did they have barbecues? Who knows? But just being sometimes being in a area of high creativity, even if you're not participating in maybe the social aspect of it, I think it inspires people to want to try to stretch out, to see what's out there, and to hit something like a pure vein that you've never seen before, like, say, foreign cinema, especially a very high quality director like Kurosawa, and I could just imagine, if you had just been John Ford was probably the ultimate that you'd been seeing at that point, to just hit this thing and go, wait, you're telling me that they're doing this all over the world, the kind of idea, and they actually doing it so good in Japan that the Americans are kind of ripping him off, because I can't remember which Clint Eastwood movie was Yojimbo. Anyway, I mean, so much so I think Kurosawa actually tried to sue people who were dipping into his ink, so to speak. But there's something to be said about that, because I mean, I don't know how many different directors, but it doesn't really take that much. All it does is take something really good at the right time to inspire somebody. It's like that idea of like, oh, I always think to myself, oh gosh, if I had had the access to the internet when I was younger, the thing is that. But you don't need it. You just need something to kind of inspire you, something to focus on, because really, yeah, okay, George, maybe initially the Star Wars, not to get ahead of things, Star Wars' inspiration was like he was initially thinking like, oh, I'll just remake the Hidden Fortress, but I'll do it in America, and maybe I'll add some sci-fi trappings to it. But that's not where he ended up. But the idea that something like that could change the whole direction of how you look at something, it takes it from a trade to being like well, no, I guess it's just, my point is that it seems very inspiring. It's that kind of, it's probably like something akin to being like maybe you weren't a musician, but you were living in Liverpool in the early 60s when, all the groups, the Mersey beat and all that kind of stuff. And it's just that creates that scene, I guess, is I don't have a better word for it. And then it feeds back on each other and people talk about it. Because it's like you take something like Turkish action films of the mid 70s and you can Google it up, and you could actually, in some regards, you can be saturated or inundated with almost too much. You get into that and it's just like something about that clicked for him. I think you can tell that it's the name that Kurosawa comes up the most with him. I mean, that seems to be like a huge influence on him. And I'm not very astute with his Kurosawa's films. I just I've seen them and whatnot, but it just, for him, I think that really gave him a jumping off point for like the next evolution of how he was viewing his career, or if he was thinking a career, just the idea of like, I could have a career, I could do this. I'm making connections. I'm excited about film. I have ideas about what I've just seen.
Yeah, again, this is another area where Lucas showed up late, right? A lot of these people who are inspired to become filmmakers in this time are students of film. These people are seriously studying the visual elements of film and paying attention to the greats in Hollywood, like Orson Welles. But they're also casting a wide net and starting to look at other countries' cinemas and see, well, how are they treating this, and how are they using this medium to create art? And then George is like, and he's fully admitted this in interviews and in his books, that like he hadn't seen a foreign movie until he actually was in film school. And so again, he's behind a little bit. And yet, once he's exposed to this, and once he sees these things, his learning curve feels like it's not as steep as other people. Like, he gets it. He gets it right away. He sees a Kurosawa film and he's like, this is something that American cinema is completely missing out on, right? And I can use elements of this. I'm inspired by the storytelling that's happening here, recognizing some of the elements of like the Hidden Fortress. We're telling this event from the perspective of the least important or lowest level people involved with it, from a totally different angle that you would not expect. And so he incorporates that in Star Wars, right? He wants to show you galactic conflict and political turmoil and civil war, but he wants to show it to you from the perspective of a farm boy and his two robots. We see Lucas again, kind of arriving late to the party, but then suddenly becoming the master of ceremonies in a way. George just seems to me like, of the people who have that experience, he's the one who actually picked it up and did something with it. I'm here on a podcast, and I took a film studies class. And I have no blockbusters coming out this fall, but George clearly saw that and put that into his quiver and was like, okay, this is another thing, another tool I have, or another weapon I have to create great cinema, and he utilized it quite effectively.
Yeah, he speaks with reverence about Kurosawa, going back and rewatching Kurosawa's work, connecting it with Lucas, the transitions, placement of the camera, angles, particularly in how action is filmed. Kurosawa had his own style, and I definitely see it in Lucas's work. Okay, so we talked about Coppola having to go off because Lucas and Coppola's independent film studio isn't doing particularly well. THX 1138 is not successful. Lucas will found his own film studio 2 years later in 1971, Lucasfilm Limited, and he will set to work on American Graffiti, which will be a financial success and pave the way for Star Wars. I've watched THX 1138. What, if anything, needs to be said about THX as a precursor or influence for Star Wars?
Aesthetically, I mean, there's the robotic police officers being a precursor to like the bumbling stormtroopers. It's a very different kind of movie. It's kind of the thing where I tried to do some research, story wise. He had written the original story, and then apparently Walter Murch, who's more known as a sound effects as an editor, and he kind of wrote the script too. And I've tried to find some discussion about the conception of it, because to be honest, it's probably from A New Hope, it's probably my favorite George Lucas film of all time. It's a dark film. It's disorientating. It's in some ways an anxiety inducing thing. It's, people go, oh, it's got a little bit of 1984, a little bit of Strange New World. It's very prototypical dystopian. It's been done so many times, from the Hunger Games to the Divergent series. I mean, I don't know if people had seen these films, but it's such an odd duck in his canon of work that back in the day when I would talk to people about, there's another Star Wars movie coming out, this would be the prequel era, and they go, oh yeah, I don't like that stuff. I like real sci-fi movies like THX 1138. And I'm like, George Lucas directed that. And he's like, what? Like, people didn't know that he had directed that. And I don't know how many of the ideas, some of the deeper ideas of religion and the role of government and the role of society, of people amongst themselves, how we interact with each other. It's almost like there's not a lot of, aside from the robotic cops, there is not a lot of it in Star Wars. I mean, I always question, is like, to be honest, if I ever had the chance to talk to George Lucas, which I never will, but I would ask him about THX 1138, because I'm curious about what made him, maybe it's projection. Maybe it's like, oh yeah, it's just like, I'm just, absolute power corrupts absolutely and blah, 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 and whatever. But it's like, it's a commentary on a lot of things that you couldn't even say would be manifest in the culture. I mean, the idea of pharmaceuticals, mass use of pharmaceuticals, of, like in the 90s when it seemed like everybody was taking Prozac, and we constantly talk about government surveillance in our homes, and klaxons of drug evasion is a criminal offense, or people going to confessionals where a tape loop of a obscure picture of Christ is there, and people kind of mumble some of their deepest, darkest secrets, and then later in the movie you find out that these are just impulses on a tape reel being played at odd intervals to placate the masses. And there's a lot of themes in that movie, just the idea of when it comes to there's always somebody that's like Donald Pleasant's character manipulates the scenario in order to try to have THX be like, I want you for my roommate, and all this kind of, even in this perfectly orchestrated society, that people are manipulating it to their own ends, and people die by the dozens at a job, and they're just kind of swept away for the next shift. And it's just this kind of vision of a future where humanity is completely dehumanized, and through no action of his own, only action by the action of his partner, his mate, who denies THX his mind-numbing drugs, that he opens up to the reality of the world that he lives in, and then goes upon this absurd journey where it's like, even as an observer, you're questioning what you're seeing, because there's people come into the thing and go, well, I'm not even real, I'm just a hologram. And it's like, he's obviously a human being. And it ends with basically him in a chase scene. So that is the one very Lucas thing, where it's like in the unfinished BART tunnels under San Francisco, he's racing some futuristic car, trying to escape from these robotic police. And then he starts climbing this stair, and and literally the whole reason he's able to escape is that you only have 14,000 credits expenditure to try to detain somebody, and when they run over budget, they're like, well, we're going back now, you should come with us. And he just keeps going, and he opens up, and then it's like, well, it's the sun, and that's all you ever know about what he's going to experience. He might be dead in 2 days. I mean, how is a man that spent his entire life drugged and being fed and entertained and told what to think, how is he going to exist outside this wall? It's a harrowing, disorientating film, to the point where even like the techniques that George never actually seemed to ever, well, similar. It's like there's a crawl in THX, but it's inverted. It's going in an opposite direction with the credits. So it's not a crawl, but it's the credits are done in this opposite manner, that from the get-go you're just disorientated, and it just doesn't feel like the music is dissonant, and the sound design is creepy. It's really something that I don't know if it was something that he needed to express, and once he got it out of his system, it never really reared its ugly head, because it's like, he had already, one of his famous statements in the 80s, about the time Return of the Jedi was wrapping up, and the From Star Wars to Jedi documentary came out on VHS, he'd say like, I never liked working for corporations, now I run one. It's that kind of, I'm still kind of confused, but delightfully so, about that movie, about like where the impulse was. It, is it secretly basically all Walter Murch and he just filmed it, or whatnot? It's like I said, it's a movie that, as time goes on, and as I watch it, and I watched it again very recently in preparation, it really is like probably like my second favorite film he's ever made. It speaks to me, and maybe that says more about me than about George, but I like it very much.
The THX experience it's strange, because it's almost like George made a film in college. I don't know if it was his graduate project or if it was his final project or whatever, but he made a short film, and then for whatever reason, I don't know if it was shown around. I know he won some awards at some festivals with it, and I don't know if it got shown to some larger companies that were willing to invest in it, but it's an odd choice for the first product for American Zoetrope when you have Coppola as co-owner founder. We know that he's got some bona fides already, and he's a little more experienced in the business. It was clearly not something the audiences wanted to see, or that they wanted to really deal with. I mean, the general public in this era is fully engulfed in post 1968 American public life. They're having war fatigue. We're on the verge of another presidential campaign. Cronkite's already said we can't win the war, etc. So a dystopian film of the nature of THX is not probably what people wanted to go to the cinema to escape the whatever it was that they were experiencing in real life, because this was a lot worse. Everything Robert said, it's a fascinating, interesting, delightfully disturbing movie to watch, but it's a tragicomic story, right? It's this brilliant thing that we can all now look back on and appreciate, but it was the wrong movie at the wrong time for what Lucas and Coppola and others were trying to achieve in that moment. But because it was probably the one they got the money for, it was the one they had to make. Now, I've seen it a couple of times. It's been a long time since I've watched it, but I did enjoy it. The only things that got really, I guess, the question about carrying forward into Star Wars or similar influences or whatnot. Star Wars won all these Oscars for nothing that had to do with Best Picture, Best Actor, or script writing or screenplay, but it won all these technical Oscars. And the THX movie that George made or directed shares a lot of those technical competencies with the soundtrack or the use of score as a character element almost in the film. Again, the cinematography the use of color or lack of color as a visual element, conveying mood to the audience, defying convention, using the different crawl / credit situation, like George tweaking things and pushing things and changing things in such a way it's new, it's strange, it's uncomfortable. I think people talked about American Graffiti. Nobody wanted, none of the studio people liked it or wanted it or even wanted to release it because they didn't understand it, because it didn't follow the studio formula. It was multiple narratives told, broken up. It was, again, not really kind of clear. Was it a comedy? Was it a teen movie? Was it a serious drama? Like, what was it? Was it all of it? Was it none of it? It's George doing something new and different and bringing, again, some of that foreign influence, the non-traditional, non-Hollywood way of making movies into making movies here domestically. All that stuff. Because George was lucky enough to be allowed to make Star Wars and that he became famous and I guess initially had to find some financial success eventually with American Graffiti and then making Star Wars and then becoming, the mogul that he was within film, that movie has kind of been preserved and lifted up. It's something that could have easily been forgotten and discarded because it was just so disjointed from popular culture in 1971 that people just be like, I don't even know what that is. Let's forget about it. It speaks to some of the stuff that he was feeling politically in the moment, but ultimately the speed with which George's life is moving at this point is, he's moving in and out of things so rapidly that maybe that was his last dying gasp. Now he's working in Hollywood. He owns a company with Coppola. He's fully in this filmmaking industry. And this is sort of his, I don't know, maybe his love letter to what is clearly a declining counterculture movement in America at that time. I mean, American Graffiti was sort of a love note to his youth. And maybe THX was sort of his like farewell note to his activism days.
With THX 1138 being essentially a commercial failure, these guys are scrambling to bring in money. So Coppola will direct The Godfather, which will be a commercial success. Lucas moves on to American Graffiti, which will be a commercial success, not for their shared company, but for Lucasfilm Limited, based on the success of American Graffiti. Now Lucas will be able to make Star Wars. Of course, it's not that simple. And let me back up just a little bit. So between 67, graduation from USC with the bachelor's degree, we talked about the Air Force. We talked about him getting involved with propaganda films, re-enrolling at USC as a grad student. But his feelings about government and Hollywood studios are going to shift dramatically. And they're really going to change with THX 1138 and American Graffiti. Why? Because studios start to edit his work. 5 minutes are cut from THX 1138. 4 minutes come out of Graffiti, and this really, really rubs Lucas the wrong way. We talked about the nepotism and the gatekeeping, but now he starts to see them as empires, an oligopoly that runs the film industry, and it's going to motivate him to break away even more. He looks at the studio executives, sees them as risk averse. They don't care or they don't understand the creative process. They're standing in the way of the financing. They control the distribution. When they offer you a contract, the contract values the distribution of films more than the actual filmmaking. And none of these things sit well with Lucas. So from your perspectives, how does that influence the writing and the production of Star Wars that's to come?
Well, I mean, I think it definitely is the beginning of the end of George Lucas as a Hollywood animal, as a person who exists in that world, because it's like he starts out, he makes one kind of experimental movie for kind of Hollywood, but under that zoetrope. And then, he makes the hit movie. Then they kind of, well, I guess, yeah, they had taken out some of the sex scenes in THX, like some nudity or something. And I don't remember what was taken out of American Graffiti, but I think by that point he was kind of realizing it's like, yeah, by hook or by crook, I am going to be very careful about how deep I'm going to go with these people, which is such an interesting way of looking now. I don't know if this is something organic to him. Maybe the idea that Francis offered, I mean, I can't remember where I think it was in the extras for the Godfather Blu-ray or something, Coppola was very like, oh, this is what we wanted to do we wanted to go up north and go to the Bay Area. And it's kind of it didn't seem like his ultimate goal was art or commerce even. It was like, oh, we'll drink wine and there'll be pretty girls hanging out while we talk about film. And it's like almost like this fantasy compound where he would work on his ideas. But it's like he immediately, I think he took The Godfather initially as a financial concern for him. It wasn't like, oh, I love the Mario Puzo book and I really want to make this. I think he wanted to do something else, but he kind of was very like, well, I need to make money and I know I can do this and I want to do it, but it's not necessarily my dream. But it seemed like George was almost immediately was like, yeah, but secretly he's thinking like, yeah, I'm going to go up and I'm going to have my own compound that I'm going to create. And I like Francis's idea, but it's like, I'm not into having, random women just reclining on couches while I, stuff. I want to make film. But I don't want people messing with my movie. And that's the idea that you go from being like, oh, a cameraman that couldn't even get into the military to do stuff like that, or getting internships, to being like, well, how dare they cut my film? How dare they take, a minute out of it? I mean, I understand as an artistic view of it, but as a commerce thing, I mean, I think it was well established since the birth of cinema that studios always meddled with pictures. Maybe that was just something that wasn't commonly known and it was a shock to him, or he was just that kind of person. And one thing I would say about George Lucas that I feel that I have divined from all the stuff I've read is that he is not a fan of criticism. And, some people say, oh, well, that artists don't get better without criticism. I think he could take criticism from a Coppola or a Spielberg or De Palma or Marshall Lucas. What he can't do is take it from some guy in a satin suit with a cigar in his mouth saying, George, it was too slow in this part, so we cut it out. And that's the kind of thing that he was like, well, it's almost like that became the whole point of his career, is to inoculate himself from the meddlings of business people. I don't know if in his own head he thought to himself, well, then I have to become the business person, because it didn't seem like he tried to quickly form any kind of partnership with a producer or a money man. And this book, this most recent book, and I forget the name of it, they claim that John Milius and him, because John Milius wrote the original screenplay for Apocalypse Now, that really that was George and Milius's baby, and eventually due to some issues Coppola got it after The Godfather 1 and 2 were made, and I guess The Conversation as well. It's almost like maybe he was listening and going like, well, I kind of like what Francis is doing, but I'm going to do it my way, and that's the only way I can make it. That's that churn of like, I'm going to make my story. It's like, that's the thing. It's like Star Wars. I have to get this done, and you'd think like, well, wait, I thought this was just some fun thing that was like kind of a riff on your childhood, almost like Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez making Grindhouse. It's like, this is just a throwback to the old Times Square movie theaters kind of thing. And it's like, it's a one and done. And you say, oh yeah, it's in the middle of the story thing. So it's like you missed half the serials. So it's like you're coming in on a Saturday. But then it's like you start to realize like, no, he had a lot more of a impetus to like, it was almost like he was saying out of his mouth, oh, yeah, that this is just a riff on, but it was something more to him. And I think he knew that he wanted to find a way to inoculate himself from this meddling or criticism. And I think, having a big success after a big success was going to be that surefire way. It's like it's not easy, but it's possible for somebody to hit one right out of the gate. To do it twice seems to be like a real effort. So it's like it wasn't guaranteed that his next film was going to be like, well, what do you want to do, George? It's like, well, I want to do this movie. It's like kind of like Flash Gordon, and people are like, what? I do think that he kind of thought he had made one movie that was kind of weird, and it didn't resonate. And then he kind of said, well, what should I go to? We'll go, write what you know. And it's like, well, I know car culture. I mean, he was very much that, I forget the name of the Toad character. He goes, oh, I was the Toad guy. He wasn't like the Ron Howard. He wasn't the Richard Dreyfuss. He was the Toad guy that was getting into trouble. So he wasn't even like the star of his own story. But I think he knew immediately, like, okay, well, that's my goal, is to just do something kind of a populist kind of thing that I will appeal to a wider audience, and then I'll take that money and then I'll build whatever Francis thought he was going to build, but I'm going to build my version of it.
The things that I would add to that, the cutting of the film deal. Now, it almost feels like George is a little naive about how Hollywood works. There is art and artistry and artists, but they are ultimately owned and run by corporations. There is a counterintuitive thing there. We hire a bunch of creative types, a bunch of free spirits, and people who are not worried about money or profitability. They're worried about vision and artistry. And so maybe that's why the studio heads are the guys with the suits and the cigars counting the beans and, doing the bottom line stuff, because the artists out there aren't caring about any of that stuff. He should have known that. I'm sure there was conversation around the water cooler there at USC Film School about it, but it feels like he was very naive moving into that culture, because being shocked and ultimately offended by the fact that someone would remove 4 minutes from your film as part of a wider release to the movie theaters is a very naive or almost dumb way to react. I mean, you're in Hollywood, you're in the film industry, right? Clearly you've heard something about this before, but I also understand the artistic compulsion of being angry about that, because I've read and heard several interviews with George about being in film school, and early on he would be in these classes and they would be given a couple of feet of film, which translates to a couple of minutes at most of screen time, depending on how fast you're running your frame rate. And then they would be told to do these projects, and again, we have the gift of hindsight and old George telling us about young George, but he would say some of his classmates would be like, oh, this is boring. When are we going to actually get to make films? When do we get to make films? This is film school. We want to make films. And these would be things where it's like, hey, we want you to run an animation machine, or we want you to run some other thing, and then capture this project or capture this thing on that film, and then turn in your film as your assignment. And George always viewed those assignments as films. He didn't treat them as a video capture of a technical event. He tried to turn them into some kind of story. And he got quite good at early on coming up with these little vignettes based on these assignments, even if they were a minute or 2 minutes. I think for him, in this sort of bent way of his, of like, I am making movies even if they're 30 seconds long and they don't even have people in them or dialogue or sound. I'm making movies. Every time I put film in a camera and I turn it on, I'm making a movie. And I think that he kind of became overly aware or concerned with every frame that he shot, and probably more so than a lot of other people in the business. And I think that people say, it's a 120 some minutes or 130 minutes of movie, and we only cut out 4. That's, very, very low. But for George, he knows exactly what you can accomplish in 4 minutes. He could make an entire movie in 4 minutes, but you happen to give him 130. For him, any little bit you shred off of his picture, in his eyes as an artist, now, as we all know, editing can save a film, and it can also ruin it, but it can also save a film. And sometimes George needs a little editing, and sometimes he doesn't. But for him, his first shot out of the gate, he was supposed to be this independent company, right, with Zoetrope, and he was supposed to be independent as a creator, and then he found out that his independence only went so far as distribution. That to him was a huge shock, and it happened again in American Graffiti, and the whole getting American Graffiti out to the theaters was this terrible, arduous process. But when they finally did get it out and it became a financial success and the general public loved it, it was the only reason why he got to make Star Wars. And the deal, was with Alan Ladd Jr. So the story goes like this: George would have these showings of the film to executives, and all the executives were like, "This is garbage. We hate this. We don't even know what it is." But then George got smart, and he's like, "Okay, well, we'll show it to the next studio, but we're instead of it being in the little viewing room where we have like 3 executives and me, we're going to rent a theater, like a standard, theater room that seats, quite a few people. And then we're going to call all of our friends from school and all the people we know in the business. And we're going to send out a thing to other executives from other studios. And we're going to have a bunch of people show up." And then suddenly, you started having these full houses, and the young people who saw it were reacting positively, and they were, clapping at the end, kind of cheering it a little bit. And the old stodgy executives in the back of their cigars like, "Well, we don't get it. This is dumb." But Alan Ladd Jr. was one of the people who showed up from another studio to see one of these showings, and he liked it, and he found George, and he said, "Yeah, I want to buy it." And he's like, "What else do you have?" And George was kind of in the process of thinking about Star Wars, and he was also thinking about some other things, but he was like, "Well, I got this space opera thing," and Alan Ladd Jr. was like, I don't know what the hell that is, but I liked American Graffiti, and if you can make whatever this other thing is that you're making in the same quality and vein as this thing that I like, then go for it. I'll sign you to like a 3-picture deal. Well, George got signed to a 3-picture deal with only 1 picture. And so the money from that got him to be able to start and work and make Star Wars. But it seems strange that he would not know about how all that worked. And then he would become this, really anti-establishment filmmaker in a weird way, working with major studios. But he would still, complain and shake his fist about the studio system. And he would quit the Directors Guild because they wouldn't let him make a movie that had all the credits at the end, because up to that point in Hollywood, you had to put all the credits at the beginning and like all this stuff. And he's shouting and fist shaking about how Hollywood's working, but then ultimately he's amassing millions of dollars after Star Wars, creating 3 or 4 companies himself and running a vast studio empire of his own. And I say this facetiously, out of his garage, basically out on the ranch, but dabbling in counterculture in his anti-establishment attitudes and sayings really only lasted for about 3 years total, when you think about it, while he was made, up to the point where Star Wars was released, basically.
In looking at the time, we're probably in line to have a part 2. Is that okay with you both?
That's fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries, man.
But I do want to finish this conversation for sure.
This is great. So part 1 of our discussion about George Lucas has come to an end. Thank you, Robert.
I want you for my roommate.
Thank you, Sean.
It has the patina of immaculate realism.
Part 2 coming soon. We will discuss Lucas as an editor and writer, the mythos of Star Wars, the OT era versus the prequel era, and Lucas's legacy.
Galactic Initiative is not authorized or endorsed by Lucasfilm Limited. The name Star Wars and all related materials are registered trademarks of Lucasfilm Limited, a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, all rights reserved. Galactic Initiative is a registered trademark, and other product and company names are trademarks of their respective holders. Use does not imply affiliation or endorsement.